A few weeks ago, I posted a video sharing my tips for painting miniature artwork, specifically mini watercolor landscapes. And I had someone ask me a question that inspired today's video. I was asked, "What's the smallest landscape you've ever painted?" Well, come to think of it, I'm not sure I've ever tried much smaller than a 3 by 3 inch square. So I thought we'd just have some fun today and see how small I can go, keeping in mind the tips from the previous video. As I paint, I will be mentioning some of those tips. However, I won't be going into as much detail. So if you do want more information about painting mini art, I'd encourage you to check out my other video. I really enjoyed making it, and I tried to include plenty of helpful examples of what seems to work for me, as well as what doesn't. I'll have a link in the description. I'll be hopping all around back and forth between these first three. And as long as they turn out okay, we'll move on to even smaller sizes. And at the end, I'll pull off the tape and measure the canvases. If you'd like to, put your guess in the comments. How small do you think we can take this and still have a somewhat recognizable painting? I'm using a set of extra small brushes, and I found that even more important than the size is the structure of the tip. Does it stay intact when you need those precise brush strokes? Or does it have loose hairs that'll make your job more challenging? These first three clearly resemble landscapes, so I'd say we're safe moving on to the next 5 paintings. On each piece of paper, I've laid out a vague plan, really simple, a few pencil lines for guidance, and at the end I think we'll have a nice variety of different scenes. You'll see that I'm using water sparingly as I get into these smaller sizes. I won't be attempting much wet on wet for a landscape of this size. Did you notice that I've simplified not only my scenes, but also my approach? I'm sticking to unmistakable shapes, and I'm not overcrowding my paper. I wasn't able to tape the edges on the last 2, so instead I used a little bit of double-sided tape to hold them in place while I paint. For the final 3 squares, I'll make sure my layers are dry before I add the details for the second layer. Even the slightest amount of bleeding will likely be too much for these itty-bitty squares to handle. It's funny, when I get into the smallest details, I actually have to take my glasses off. My vision is terrible far away, but I can see the close-ups better without my glasses than with. For most of these scenes, I'm using a very lightly textured cold-pressed watercolor paper. But for the smallest sizes, I'm using hot-pressed paper without any texture at all. This will help with a more crisp image for the smallest of the small. It looks like I might have to finish the final touches once the camera is off, because I always wind up blocking the camera when I get too close. I know, this last picture can barely be called a landscape, but I mean, it does have a sky, a single tree, and a touch of earth, so what do you think? Does it count or not? Okay, time for my favorite part, the peeling of the tape. So the first one here measures 3 inches by 3 inches. And now onto the winter scene with the wooden fence. 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. The desert sunset with saguaro cactus. It measures 2 inches by 2 inches. Next up, the simple beach scene. This one is 1.5 by 1.5 inches. The mountain with a single pine tree. Measures 1 square inch. This wilderness scene is 3/4 of an inch. The tiny nighttime painting is 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And finally, the baby oak tree measures 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. It's about the size of my pinky nail. Good luck finding a frame for this one. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I know it was kind of a silly project, but I actually think there was some value in it. I found myself considering what details were most important to what I wanted to convey, and what I could live without. I know that I'm sometimes guilty of overcrowding and overwhelming my paintings, so it was a good exercise in editing for me. So if you feel like your own art might benefit from some editing, maybe you can give a mini painting a try, but maybe try something a little bigger than 1/4 of an inch.